What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com.
Here are my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL Week 11.
Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button
And hit that bell icon.
so you don't miss our new videos.
In this video, I'm going to go over each position and give you my fantasy football starts and sits for NFL this week. This should help you decide who you want to start in your season-long fantasy football leagues. And we will show you how to use the Draft Dashboard tools to dominate your season-long fantasy leagues. You can find waiver wire targets, get player point projections, find the best positional matchups to see who is projected to score the most fantasy points this week. These tools will help you decide what players to start in your fantasy football leagues. We have it all right here, so let's get into it. Okay guys, NFL Week 11, let's take a look at my starts and sits. At the quarterback position, so of course you're starting Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, Ben Roethlisberger, but another quarterback you're going to start this week is Kirk Cousins from the Minnesota Vikings playing the Dallas Cowboys, who have the third worst defense overall, and they give up the 8th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Kirk Cousins has averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game on the season. He scored 19 and 21 fantasy points in the last 2 games. He's projected at 16 fantasy points here in Week 11, and he's $6,200 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. But I think he can score more than 16 fantasy points in this one. I've got him for 20 plus fantasy points this week because he has a fantastic matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys. So I like Kirk Cousins here versus the Dallas Cowboys. Another quarterback I'm going to start that I've been pretty scared to start in the previous weeks, but this week I'm going to start Cam Newton from the New England Patriots playing the Houston Texans, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks. Cam Newton has averaged 20.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 10 rush attempts per game. He scored 17, 25, and 19 fantasy points in the last 3 games. He's projected at 17.8 fantasy points here in Week 11, and he's $6,200 DraftKings salary and $1,400 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 2.5. So one of the main reasons that I want to start Cam Newton this week is because of his rushing floor. The Houston Texans are awful defending the rush, so Cam Newton, who's getting an average of 10 rush attempts per game, he only has to throw for 1 touchdown because he's probably going to run the ball for 50 or 60 yards and maybe a touchdown on the ground. It's a pretty high scoring game for a Patriots game, and it's a close competitive game. So I like Cam Newton here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, what quarterback are we going to sit in Week 11? This one may come as a surprise to you, but I'm going to sit Ryan Tannehill from the Tennessee Titans playing the Baltimore Ravens, who have a good defense overall, and they've been good versus opposing quarterbacks. Ryan Tannehill has averaged 20.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 2.7 rush attempts per game. But he's only scored 11, 15, and 18 fantasy points in the last 3 games. So his production has fallen off quite a bit in the past few games. And although he is projected at 19.8 fantasy points here in Week 11, and he's $6,100 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel, I don't like this matchup. Vegas thinks there's going to be 49 points scored in this game, and they have the Tennessee Titans trailing by 6.5. So the Baltimore Ravens have excellent pass coverage, so I'm going to sit Ryan Tannehill here versus the Baltimore Ravens. Okay, let's take a look at the running back position. I'm going to start DeAndre Swift from the Detroit Lions playing the Carolina Panthers, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. DeAndre Swift has averaged 14.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 7.8 rush attempts per game and 4.3 pass targets per game. But he's had an increased role the past couple of weeks. With Kenny Golladay out, he got 16 and 13 rush attempts in the last 2 weeks and 5 pass targets in each of those games, scoring 26 and 13 fantasy points in the last 2 games. He's projected at 14.8 fantasy points here in week 11, and he's $6,400 DraftKings salary and $500 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks the Detroit Lions are going to be trailing by 1.5, so they have this as a close, competitive game. It's a great matchup. It looks like they're starting to trust DeAndre Swift as the primary ball carrier, and they're involving him quite a bit in the passing game. 21 touches last week. I think he continues that momentum here in a good matchup, so I like DeAndre Swift here versus the Carolina Panthers. Another running back I'm going to start this week is Damien Harris from the New England Patriots playing the Houston Texans, who have the 4th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing running backs. Damien Harris has averaged 11.1 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 14.2 rush attempts per game. He got 22, 14, and 16 rush attempts in the last 3 games, so his rushing volume has increased in the past few weeks, and he's projected at 7.7 fantasy points here in week 11. I think that projection is way too low. This is a fantastic matchup, and the New England Patriots are a run-first offense. He is $5,700 DraftKings salary and $100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 48 points scored in this game, with the Patriots favored by 2.5. So I'm going to start Damien Harris here versus the Houston Texans. Okay, what running back are we going to sit here in week 11? This guy's been nothing but disappointment week after week. So I'm going to sit Melvin Gordon from the Denver Broncos playing the Miami Dolphins, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, and they're middle-of-the-pack defending opposing running backs. Melvin Gordon has averaged 12.8 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 13.4 rush attempts per game and 3.6 pass targets per game. He's projected at 11.7 fantasy points here in week 11, and he's $5,100 DraftKings salary and $1,300 more on FanDuel. So not a great matchup here. His rushing volume has been low because he's splitting carries with Phillip Lindsay. The Denver Broncos aren't giving him a lot of goal line carries. It's just been tough for him to muster up fantasy points. So I'm going to sit Melvin Gordon here versus the Miami Dolphins.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all the tools for NFL, MLB is still going, NBA is right around the corner. This is a great time to get in and try everything for 1 month. The tools are all about saving research time. You can see the last 3 games, the fantasy points per game, the targets they got per game, so you can see how involved they are in the offense, the rushes they got per game. Seeing all this stuff on one screen helps you save time and make better picks. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, let's take a look at the wide receiver position. I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. from the Detroit Lions playing the Carolina Panthers, who have the 10th worst defense overall, and their middle of the pack defending opposing wide receivers. Marvin Jones Jr. has averaged 11.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.7 pass targets per game. But now that Kenny Golladay is out, he got 10 pass targets last game, scored 24 fantasy points. He's projected at 12.7 fantasy points here in week 11. He's $5,500 DraftKings salary and $900 more on FanDuel. So a decent matchup here. I like the increased passing volume. So I'm going to start Marvin Jones Jr. here versus the Carolina Panthers. Another wide receiver I'm going to start is Amari Cooper from the Dallas Cowboys playing the Minnesota Vikings, who have the 8th worst defense overall, and they give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers. Amari Cooper has averaged 16.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 9.2 pass targets per game. Now, he's been kind of up and down since Dak Prescott went out. He scored 13 fantasy points last week, 2 the week before that, and 16 the week before that, off of 6, 5, and 7 pass targets. So he's not getting as much volume as he did with Dak Prescott out, but now he's got a fantastic matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings, and he's projected at 12.5 fantasy points here in week 11. He's $5,400 DraftKings salary and $1,500 more on FanDuel. I think he's going to have one of the best cornerback matchups on the slate, so I'm going to start Amari Cooper here versus the Minnesota Vikings. Okay, what wide receiver are we going to sit in week 11? I'm going to sit T.Y. Hilton from the Indianapolis Colts playing the Green Bay Packers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they've been pretty good versus opposing wide receivers, and T.Y. Hilton has only averaged 6.9 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.5 pass targets per game. He's projected at 9.2 fantasy points here in week 11, and he's $4,200 DraftKings salary and $1,200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Colts favored by 2.5. So this is a game I think Green Bay Packers are going to win, but they do have the Colts favored here. And T.Y. Hilton just hasn't shown much upside throughout the whole season. He's been struggling to find the end zone, struggling to find those big plays, and now he's got a bad matchup. So I'm going to sit T.Y. Hilton here versus the Green Bay Packers. Okay, moving on to the tight end position. I'm going to start Hayden Hurst from the Atlanta Falcons playing the New Orleans Saints, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, but they give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Hayden Hurst has averaged 10.7 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 6 pass targets per game. He scored 13, 10, and 13 fantasy points in the last 3 games off of 8, 7, and 7 pass targets. He's projected at 11.3 fantasy points here in week 11, and he's $4,400 DraftKings salary and $1,100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 51.5 points scored in this game, with the Falcons trailing by 4.5. So great tight end matchup here. It's a high-scoring game and a passing game script. I like the passing targets he's got the past 3 weeks. He's been quite productive. So I'm going to start Hayden Hurst here versus the New Orleans Saints. Another tight end I'm going to start is Logan Thomas from the Washington Redskins playing the Cincinnati Bengals, who have the 7th worst defense overall, and they give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Logan Thomas has averaged 8.5 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 5.8 pass targets per game. He's projected at 8.4 fantasy points here in week 11, He's $3,300 DraftKings salary and $1,900 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 46.5 points scored in this game, with the Washington football team favored by 1.5. So great matchup here. Excellent tight end matchup. Second best tight end matchup on the slate. And now they have Alex Smith at the quarterback position, who's an accurate passer. He favors the tight ends. So I'm going to start Logan Thomas here versus the Cincinnati Bengals. Okay, who are we going to sit at the tight end position? I'm going to sit Robert Tonyan from the Green Bay Packers playing the Indianapolis Colts, who have the second best defense overall, and they give up the absolute fewest fantasy points to opposing tight ends. Robert Tonyan has averaged 10.2 fantasy points per game on the season, getting an average of 3.6 pass targets per game. But he only scored 6 and 2 fantasy points in the last 2 weeks off of 4 and 1 pass targets. So that volume's coming down. His production hasn't been that great, and he is projected at 7.9 fantasy points here in week 11, and he's $3,200 DraftKings salary and $2,400 more on FanDuel. So Vegas thinks there's going to be 51 points scored in this game, with the Packers trailing by 2.5, but he's got an awful matchup here versus an excellent Indianapolis Colts defense. So the targets and production have been down the past couple of weeks. I don't think this is the spot to start him, so I'm going to sit Robert Tonyan here versus the Indianapolis Colts.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NFL slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.